In the first year, we discussed first the tone of the whole class. We talked about the myths to the mystic being literal. That is, we live in a spiritual world that is filled with gods and demons and fairies and all other kinds of beings. And that the myths represent multifaceted, how would you say it, direct expressions of their being. In a way, they have to be taken very, very literally, because everything that becomes manifest and realized in the cosmos does so through myth being turned into history. And so we talked that way about myths. In the second talk, we corrected and said that sometimes myths, because we live in the phenomenal world and not in the purely transcendental spiritual realms, some things get reversed in the focus from the spiritual realms to the material. And we looked at some myths that said just the opposite of what they seem to be on the surface. We talked about Sisyphus, and we talked about Narcissus, and a number of beings like that where the meaning was the opposite of what it seemed to be. Then we had a subsection on myths of creation. And the whole idea was that by looking at creation myths, we could see how every moment in time was a replication or reproduction of the first moment of time, because from a mystical point of view, we live in one complete moment. And each sub-moment within that is a reproduction of it. And so we thought that by looking at creation myths, we could find some of the formulae that mark every moment that we live in. We looked at first at the classical creation myths of the Greeks, those of the early and late Greeks, and we looked at a Native American creation myths, we looked at biblical creation myths, and we ended up spending a lot of time on Hindu creation myths. After that, we decided to look at the mysteries and the mystery schools themselves, because the mystery schools, whether they're the Eleusinian mysteries or Native American mysteries, are the means that people have used to get in touch with the spiritual worlds and to take very extreme steps forward in evolution toward becoming better people and eventually demigods. And we looked at some of the myths that were used by mystery schools, and we tried to look at them on different levels, and we tried to look at different vehicles of interpretation, like spiritual physiology and spiritual astronomy and things like that. And we looked at the myths of Isis, Osiris, and Horus first, because we looked at some of the ideas as they were used in the myths, in the mysteries of Isis, followed by the mysteries of Osiris. And we spent a long time looking at the Eleusinian mysteries through the myth of Demeter and Persephone, and we looked at that myth on several levels. Then we looked at some other ideas of the mystery schools, most notably the idea of distribution, where the one spirit becomes more and more distributed through the complexities of external manifestation and going into the realms of details. And we did that by looking at the mystery myth of Zagreus, Dionysius, Bacchus. And then we ended up talking about some of the impossibilities of the differences between the outer world and the perceptive reality we have by being focused through the physical body and the brain versus the inner consciousness that we have, how the inner spiritual worlds can't be taken wholesale into the external world And the consciousness that we have, the external world, can't be taken inwardly completely. And we did that through the vehicle of the Orpheus myth. And last year, we talked all year long about myths of heroes and heroines, and we looked at them in terms of the whole idea of spiritual growth and the work that we do every day to become better people. This year we're going to have another topic, and we're going to be very slow because I've been studying and studying and studying away. I have the ideas developed that I want to present, but how to use the myths as the vehicle to get there is it's an enormous amount of work. We're going to be talking about hierarchy and consciousness. To a large extent, the spiritual worlds are different from the outlook of the mundane world. In the outlook of the mundane world, everything is valuable as everything else. If you're in a sinking boat and a radio weighs 50 pounds and a child weighs 50 pounds, in the material world they're both equal as far as the ship sinking or not. In the spiritual realms, there is not that kind of relativism, though if a person does not have a really clear consciousness, there is so much that it does seem chaotic and everything is relative. But there is more of the vertical consciousness rather than the spectra of each plane. In the spiritual worlds, there are greater and greater things of greater and greater importance. And if we want to grow spiritually, and in our consciousness, it's native to our being that some things are more important than other things. Some values are of a much more important nature than others. Some things are more causally antecedent to others. And that's what we're going to be looking at, but it's going to take us a little while, a few weeks, before we actually even get to the hierarchy. In fact, we're going to look at all kinds of different things in hierarchy. We're going to look at various pantheons of divinities and creative hierarchies. For the beginning of the year, we're going to meet every other week. We'll meet 2 weeks from tonight, until I get warmed up and get into the study that I want to get done, and then we'll probably meet every week again, because I'll have so much I'll want to say. It's already turning out that way, and I will have had done all the studying. So maybe by Christmas we'll be going to meeting once a week. But I promise you I won't do what we did last year. We wound up last year because I didn't want to continue going all the way through summer. We ended up with one long talk of 2 hours and 40 minutes. It won't be that. So we're going to look at pantheons of gods. So before we can do that, we're going to start looking first at the Hindu pantheon. And then we're going to go to the Egyptian. And then we're going to go to the Greek. And then we're going to go to the Norse. And then we're going to switch to other topics, and we're going to look at more at direct hierarchies. And we may look at the Chaldean oracles of Zoroaster or something like that, because they present hierarchy in a much different fashion. And I think we might end up with hierarchy as used in schools of alchemy, looking at the hierarchies of metals and the hierarchies of plants and things like that, to bring things more in touch with the world that we're in now. Tonight we're going to look at, before we can talk about hierarchies of gods, we have to talk about divinity itself. And it's going to take us about maybe 4 weeks before we go through all the things I want to say, because of all the sidelong things that come up. Looking at myths of just different gods or different attributes of God to get the notion of divinity, what makes for spiritual consciousness as opposed to the kind of consciousness that we have, which is exceedingly limited and exceedingly egocentric and, in our case, very much focused on matter and on forms in matter rather than on the meaning and the spiritual stuff of it. So we're going to go back and we're going to look at some of the myths that we looked at previously, but we're going to look at them as though they were altogether different myths. We're going to look at, in the Hindu pantheon, there is one concept that is called Brahm. And that is a concept of an ineffable being that is beyond all normal human consciousness, and that is unspeakable, and it's just not capable of being put into our kinds of words. But that consciousness, or that being, when it is made manifest through 3 different divinities, and those 3 different divinities are, in some cases, very superstitiously taken as gods that are in human-like form. And they are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. We're going to talk about Brahma, and because that is as deep as things go in the spiritual worlds. Of course, these things being a tetrahedron of existence, you might say that that the one focuses itself into the other 3, and that the one is in a position that's superior to all of them. This tetrahedron of consciousness, the 1 in 3 and the 3 in 1, is common to all concepts of divinity. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. It can be understood, like most things in the spiritual worlds, the unity of being, the one being, is self-reproduced through every level of being. The level that we speak of it at may not be the deepest level, but it is a microscopic, an image of a deeper and deeper level. The same principle is there. We'll talk more about this a little bit later. Since Brahma is the first manifest, all of the things of Brahma have to be about creation myths, because there is nothing before that. Of course, all of the mystery schools speak about a cycle of spiritual being and spiritual non-being, and that there are the great sleeps, which are called pralaya, and then there are the great cosmic days of manifestation. Everything that comes to be manifest is manifest through Brahma. It is the first in terms of manifest being. We're talking about the thing that differs human consciousness, ordinary human consciousness, and divine consciousness is creation. That is one of the first things. It is as if to say the spirit becomes itself and advances itself by giving itself off in creation. It derives from itself new being by creating and sharing with all of the other beings that then advance with the retrograde forms of creation that come from the original creator. And in that, this is, you might say, a two-way street in one action. It is an action and reaction principle. You can say that God is God to God. That is to say, we raise ourselves by aspiring to something beyond ourselves. We idealize, or we aspire, or we have some ideals that we reach to, and when we look up to them, we come out of ourselves and raise to a higher level. In the process of looking to something more ideal, when it comes to the level of the one, it finds God within itself, and it is God is God to God, and it raises itself by penetrating ever deeper within its being. But that is one of the directions. That is, like you might say, a perpetual transcendence. But that perpetual transcendence is accomplished by a perpetual creation, by continuously giving things that are not it, by throwing off forms that are not it. The elimination principle, which is the creation principle. Anybody who knows anything about astrology knows that Scorpio is the principle of both elimination and the principle of creation, that the source of life and death is found in one place. Only this is more vertical again. This is a not just a simple recycling. This is a going ever deeper into the unknown, and from that manifesting new creative forms. So the reason why we're speaking of Brahma first is because Brahma was first. And well, I'm not saying that we're Hindus or anything like that. We're talking about ideas and principles. You might say that from the Christian point of view, this would be the Father, this would be the Son, this would be the Holy Spirit. And in fact, in many ways, they follow really nicely. We'll look into things like that later. But the first attribute, then, if we want to awake to divine consciousness, is creation. The degree of freedom that we have, we say a person is relatively free if a person, the United States is called a free country because we have elections and we can choose what we want to do and who is going to execute what we do. And that is the first degree of freedom, is the freedom of choice. You choose between the things that are there. But it's a much deeper degree of freedom and of divine being when you are not coerced by law, and you get beyond even the freedom of choice to when you get to the freedom of creation. That you can create within the divine principles, and you can even create the divine principles themselves. So we're talking about living within a creative being, and that's why we're working with Brahma as being the first, because Brahma is the Lord of creation, or the Lord of recreation, because it is continuously regenerate and it continuously goes into itself more deeply. Now, Brahma on the highest level, even this would be the little triangle. If there were another triangle or tetrahedron, that the little one was within, that is on the level of the Supreme Being, or the Word, within the unknown. This is within that of which we can't speak. that which is becoming, or that which is perpetually beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That is to say, the Word and God were together, but they were in the beginning. That's as much as you can call the absolute unknown is the beginning. So we're going to be talking about that. So we're going to look at creation myths. We're going to tell some stories or retell some stories. And I'm not choosing them in historical order. I'm choosing them in some kind of logical order, or cosmological or cosmogenical order, so that we can get at the ideas we want to get at. We'll start from later commentaries. We'll start from the Upanishads. And the story of creation in the ultimate level from the Upanishads are one of them, because Hindu mythology is filled with hundreds and hundreds of creation myths, and they're told with different variants, and each time there's a new variant, it's just richer and richer with the different things that come out of them. In the beginning, there was a being or a spirit or a soul. And it looked around. Most likely it looked through its own light, and it saw nothing but itself, which is all one can see if one is at the highest level of being, is only self, or probably selfness. And then it said, I am. And in the statement of its existence, when it said, I am, it came into being, and the I, or the being or beingness of the I, became a recognition of the primal unity of all creation. The Hindus, even though they do things very much in story fashion, get rather syllogistic about it. In fact, syllogistic so far that even Descartes would be pleased with it. And then something very peculiar happens. Brahma, or Prajapati, as it was called in the older times, was afraid. And then it said to itself, since there is none other than me, of what am I afraid? So it is there is nothing to be afraid of, and then the fear vanished. Because one is always afraid of a second one. But when it realized that there was nothing to be afraid of, the one was relieved of its fear, but it also had something else in its place, loneliness. It realized that it was alone. And it's really amazing how much fear and loneliness go together, even in our psychology from day to day, that they're there. It wanted a second. And so what it did is it fell into two. Its desire for companionship caused it to split within itself. And this is also very true to very prosaic psychology. People who spend a lot of time alone talk to themselves. And they have a much more partitioned consciousness. And in some cases, if they become very unrealistic so that they're not overwatching their split consciousness, they start talking out loud. It's all right to talk to yourself, but if you start doing it out loud, you may be in trouble, because then you're not overlooking the whole situation. And you might say then that the overlooking of the partitioned consciousness represents the birth of the three right away in the beginning. The one then in dividing was in its being and in its willing to be and wanting to be was masculine, in the sense that it was not receptive or passive. When it divided itself, it was masculine and feminine, but the part of it that was conscious of itself was masculine, and it desired the part that was unconscious, and it united with itself. And humankind, by this it doesn't mean people with bodies like us, but people with self-conscious intelligences. Like when we say one is one way or one is another way, what was born were ones. Now the other part of the one reflected, that is the wife of Prajapati, or the wife of Brahma, started reflecting, and the word reflecting is a very important word, because the unconscious part, the passive part, reflects, it doesn't project. And it becomes, with its demi-consciousness, it says, for shame, how can he incestuously unite with me? This means to say that in the highest sense, the only way that we can speak, the only metaphor or the only form that we can give to creation that comes out of unity must involve incest. Both incest in form and incest in a kind of spiritual narcissism where we love ourselves. Now this to the Hindus has a really unusual name. It is called ascetically contemplating self. Like all of the gods become divine and do all of their great creative works by contemplating themselves, or themselves. I don't know how to say it. It's oneself anyway. And that by, this is like if all of our divine advancement comes either by aspiration to something beyond ourselves, or in the case of the one, within ourselves, this means a self-contemplation. But it's a self-contemplation that has a power that is something like desire. And it has the same kind of curiosity to know, and there is a belief that there is something that can come from creation. I think the same thing that is told to us is told to the gods by themselves. Ask whatsoever ye will, and it will be given unto you. So when you form questions realizing that there is an answer, any creative proposition is that same kind of question. So at any rate, the divine female part of Prajapati decides to flee. And that's just another way of describing that the more one contemplates oneself and turns inward, there is a flow that goes outward, that it seems like things are running away from you. And the forms that eventually, the forms and the realms and the worlds that eventually become the cosmos that we know, are things that seem to be like a waterfall rushing away from the fountainhead of the creative consciousness. And this is in the Hindu myth. It's really interesting the way they say that. the female counterpart of Prajapati metamorphizes into various different realms. And in each evolutionary realm, the Brahma spirit follows. And as it follows, because even though we have these pictured as going within and above, they're actually in the same space. So that the forms and the meaning of the forms and the divinity that knows itself through the forms actually are following into the same realms of space. And the way it's pictured in the very homespun way in the Hindu myth is that the female counterpart of Prajapati takes on all of these forms, metamorphizing. It gets rather bucolic. She takes the form of a cow and he takes the form of a bull. This is after all the worlds have been created and such like that. And in each case, those things are engendered and they come to life by that action. In all of this, because he said, I am lonely, and because he said, I want someone and produced someone, he spoke this. And he created this fire, the forms, and the fire that inhabits these forms from his mouth. And this mouth, strangely enough, in the Hindu myths, is called the yoni, which is the same as the cunis, the same word for the cunis. That is to say that the mouth and the receptual sexual organs or the womb are one and the same thing. And then they really do some very interesting little puns in their creative mythology. Therefore, because the fire and the forms born out of the fire come from the mouth, they are consumed. Because the mouth eats as well as it speaks. And therefore, the semen soma, the consumed and the consumer, are created in a ritual sacrifice. And out of this, to the Hindus, the whole notion of ones being born out of that internal division, or threefold ones being out of that internal division, they are consumers. And this is, of course, the capitalists would love this, but ultimately all humans are consumers. And so all of the whole act of creation, the whole act of reuniting, or the original union that ended up into a division that replicates or goes back to the original unity and is engendered over again and again, is done as a sacrifice. So that's as far as we're going to follow that story. But it's an interesting story. It shows that the whole idea that everything has to be born out of oneness, and it shows that the ultimate nature of all things, even if there is an apparent division between the make-believe and the illusion and the form and the consciousness that is discovering itself within itself relative to those forms that are divided within its being, within all of that there is a unity. Meaning to say that not only is the primary attribute of the divine creative, but it is creative in unity. And there can be no self-contradictions. There can be no inconsistencies. Ultimately, everything resolves to a state of oneness. And the more deeply we can penetrate into that knowing of selfhood, the more we can find that common unity. Now remember, we're still trying to get to the whole idea of divinity in these talks. And so, I don't want to stray too far in the storytelling or the philosophy. So all self-consciousness is self-generated, is the other principle. That doesn't mean to say that it is false or that it is all just made up make-believe. It means something like, it's like a cyclone, or it's like a vortex that in waking up and more deeply becoming awake to self and contemplating self, one penetrates in deeper and deeper, and this starts like a whirlpool. Even the awakening of clairvoyance produces a whirlpool in the desire body in the center of the forehead, which blazons like a brilliant light. And the more deeply one contemplates that, it's not a make-believe, but it's a make-believe made true by considering the possibility of something and then giving oneself to it totally as a spontaneous creative act of devotion and sacrifice. It brings the unity to that in a way that it was never known before, and it becomes realized. So all creation is a progression of a divine consciousness divided within itself by contemplating within itself and such. So we see then that there is a great connection between fear and ignorance and loneliness and desire and curiosity. They're all attributes of that one thing. You might say that this is a great creative experiment that, as much as it being a desire to overcome loneliness or the fear of being alone, you could say that it is a great curiosity, and you could say it in the Grotanian sense of ever seeking the infinite feminine that is leading us on the unknown, that we go more and more deeply within ourselves. Okay, all of the above is done in love, and it's done in full self-conscious attention. Now we're going to go to something that is actually much more primitive in terms of time, and it's the myth that we just looked at from the Upanishads is a more late in time rendition of one that came from the Brahmanas. In fact, we're going to go for a while. We're going to go backwards to get to the ideas we want. Prajapati was alone, and it contemplated within itself, how may I produce progeny? And here the classical terms come in. This is even demons and even wicked human beings gain great power by practicing asceticism. And so Prajapati practiced contemplative asceticism to the point of exhaustion. And that's really a very important point. I don't know how the greatest creative discoveries or the greatest intuitive hits that one will get comes when one concentrates or goes into the point of exhaustion. And at that point, it even relates to this plane, because it's so beautiful the way these things go, that when you contemplate something to the point of exhaustion, when you relax from that, you relax in a way that you are open like you were never, ever open before. I think the first time this ever happened to me was almost 30 years ago. I concentrated on something where I was forming very strong visual images inside of me, almost as though I were in looking at a movie screen inside of my closed-eyed consciousness. And I kept trying to look at what I was contemplating, something astrological. a cosmological kind of astrology, and I worked on that and worked on that for all night long. And in the morning, I was exhausted and just sort of laying there. This was near a campfire. And I was leaning against the automobile. And what happened was at the first edge of dawn, something, I was so relaxed, it's like a piston went up my spine. And from the center of my forehead, everything was vibrating, boom, so heavy like that I couldn't handle it, and it actually knocked me out. It was, I picked myself off the ground a few minutes later, because it was, but all right, so but that's anything. That's the whole idea. I didn't mean to talk about personal experiences, but Prajapati or Brahma practiced asceticism to exhaustion, and when he did so, he produced fire from his mouth. And here's where that idea comes from in the later myth. Therefore, since it is mouth-born, Agni, the fire, is a consumer. And then it demanded food for its continued existence. It's very much like that children's story, The Little Prince. You're responsible for what you tame. You're responsible for what you create. And so he produced the firstborn from Brahma was the fire, and the fire was a consumer, and Brahma was then responsible for it. Then Agni turned to Prajapati and opened the mouth. And Agni was nothing but a mouth of fire. And what happened then is all of the greatness went out of Brahma into Prajapati. Meaning to say that the power of creative speech, when it goes into the consumer, it goes in one way out of the creator. And then Prajapati was forced to take care of his creation. So what he did, now figuratively, because clearly this is something that takes place in space, Prajapati started rubbing his hands together. And as he did so, he churned space, and he churned space into a milkiness, and that eventually he turned into butter. The early stages of the production of an interstellar or intergalactic ether is sometimes described as the churning of a butter, of a milk into space. It's some kind of like a magnetic plasma, if you want to look at it in a very materialistic sense. But he churned it until it became butter. And then he offered the butter to Agni, the fire, as a sacrifice. And this is the origin of the butter sacrifice, because butter is a very rare item in India, because you have to have cows and you have to do all the work to make the butter. It was offered as a sacrifice. But Agni demanded more and more and more, and didn't demand it by asking for it, but by needing it. And thus, everything in the cosmos was created by Prajapati, and it was offered as a sacrifice. I don't know how you can find a more beautiful myth than that. Everything that exists in the cosmos, even beings as lowly and mean as ourselves, were offered as a sacrifice, and it's almost the way we are treated like spoiled children. The whole being, the whole glorification unto exhaustion of the divine being, because the one doesn't do anything half-heartedly. You cannot produce a creation. It's nip and tuck. It's more balanced than the types of things that we do. We get specialized and we do only one thing and we get all off balance. But the one being is completely and totally balanced, but it gives itself totally, and it gives itself as a sacrifice. So not only is God to God as something to worship in the sense that it transcends within itself, but it does that by offering every little minute thing as a sacrifice to a consumption of its own making. All right, I didn't mean to get off into that much on the side, but you get the whole idea that we're trying to get here. All of creation is born as a question. How can I produce progeny if I'm all alone? You might say then that the whole of creation is the whole question of loneliness. And I think that all of our individual spiritual growth is also a production of loneliness. When we stop trying to seek other people outside of ourselves to try and satisfy us, but we go within ourselves and try to recognize that the loneliness is found everywhere in the cosmos, and go into ourselves to find something to sacrifice and give, is when we have company. It's really interesting. One of the names for Brahma is Ka. And Ka is the word. It's another one of those solipsistic kinds of puns or metaphysical tricks that the Hindu saints and mystics use. They ask, who has seen the beginning of all of this? Or who is behind this all? And therefore, they name the highest being Who, because who is the one that is behind it. It's really a lovely way of doing it, because, yeah, it is, because it is as impersonal as you can get it. You're not, it's so strange to me that the Hindus have the height of superstition and idolatry and all of that, and behind it all is just the opposite. It's one of those great dichotomies of character, that there is all of the materialistic complexity and at the same time all of this deep spiritual subtlety. We've talked a little bit about the practicing asceticism, and that's going to come up again, so I won't make this too long and drawn out. We've talked a little bit about the all-and-out effort of this. God is terrible. That it is ultimately powerful. I don't know, there's a psychological thing that happens when one gets into the unconscious instinctual mind, that you get around things that could be dangerous, and you begin to imagine in your mind, like I think that's what's behind all those cartoons with safes falling from buildings and things like that. But if you start thinking of this dawned on me a few years ago. I don't know how it was, but I had a piece of railroad track. It was about 2 feet long, and I was picking it up, and I let my consciousness drift, and I dropped it on my toe. And that turned out to be a cosmological experience for me, because I just because it hurt. And in the contemplating of the hurt, I just thought the immensity just of all the railroad tracks in the world. And then I started thinking about the immensity of the earth itself as such a huge, heavy, solid boulder, and how this was being heaved through space, and yet at the same time there was that irony that it was so delicate that you can have spider webs and flower petals and things like that existing on the surface of it. At the same time, there's this great power just throwing it through space. And you think of the whole cosmos being that way. And when you're thinking about the myth as the myth of Prajapati and the creation of the whole business, it's a really fiery, violent, terrible kind of thing because of the immense power. But that immense power is because of asceticism. And it's because of very, very great subtlety. The most powerful things in the cosmos are not the most dramatic things. They're the most subtle things. So what we're trying to get at with the nature of divinity is the nature of subtlety. Something of great power, something that is ultimately sacrificial, and because it's sacrificial, it's giving up. And it's giving up unto exhaustion, and I don't know how you can talk about something more, would you say it? Extenuated and weakened and tremulous and such like that. It is a subtlety that is a great power because it has given itself all the way to the deepest degree of subtlety. All right, we've got a few more little stories here. We have 2 pages yet. I can whip along really quickly. The last half a page is no story at all. Now we're going further back in time. And we're going all the way back to the oldest of the Hindu books. We're going to the Rig Veda. And not only is it old, it's primal. And it's primal in a way that some people would consider rude. And because the imagery is not only bucolic, it's almost profane. And the creation story opens here by saying that the one had its phallus stretched out to cosmic proportions in anticipation of the deed. And he pulled back in anticipation of the deed. And with the cosmic stretched out phallus, he united with his daughter in tireless thrusts and withdrawals. As he was satisfying his desire for the very young girl, some of the seeds spilled out. From the sacred seed Rudra, which is another name for Shiv, or another name for Agni, or another name for the generative part of divinity. Agni, which was part of Rudra, directed the seed, and from that the emissaries were born. The Angirases were born. That's the ancient Sanskrit name. This is a little bit more difficult to ponder. That's the story as far as it goes. It's really interesting. In every conversation that I have several Hindu friends, and in every conversation that I've had with them, they don't have shame about sexuality, and they don't have guilt about sexuality in the prudish ways that people in the West do. I think that in the West, the idea of asceticism and the idea of generative purity almost tries to do away with the whole idea of creative power. But it's much easier to talk about the subject, and it's much easier to talk about it in its divine nature, because this is embedded in the consciousness of children from early on. The divine desires experience. Again, what was curiosity and what was loneliness, another attribute of divinity in its deepest sense is desire. Not a personal desire for a thing or for something that we wish to grandify ourselves or uplift ourselves or build ourselves for a selfish sake. There is a desire for experience. And this is why the vehicle is taken as sexual desire. It isn't a selfish, it isn't a lascivious kind of thing. The word that is used is anticipation. It is anticipation that brings about the divine, freeing, creative experiences. Anticipation, like some schools of mysticism have their whole mystical philosophy based on anticipation. Like, for example, the Zen Buddhists, they anticipate to the point they almost get antithetical about it. There's nothing more to anticipate, and that's all the more whetting of that kind of curiosity. The whole idea, this sees the division not only as just falling into two, but in the divine thrusting, the whole nature of something that is cyclical, night and day, dark and light, in and out. It is seen, the division is seen in a dimension more than in space. It's seen as something that goes into a temporal dimension, so that there is a sense of time that is also divided. And the really interesting thing about this creation myth is that everything that becomes the cosmos is the result of the seed that is spilled. It's such a generous, it's like all of the rest is contained, and this is almost like a tantric myth, that everything else is retained within, and it's only some extra. It's sort of like the overflow of being that allows for creativity. It's very common in all of the creation myths and even a lot of the practical myths for actually practicing asceticism, that the idea is that 3/4 of self is not associated with phenomenal things at all, that the greater part of self is in the completely transcendent spiritual realms, and that the meaning, that deeply penetrable meaning that is behind all of this, in its self-contemplation, it allows a certain amount of overspill. You might say that what is the creation is the generous amount that is going beyond itself from before, and that there is no subtraction of self, even though things are done unto exhaustion, but it is that what is new is something where you have gone beyond yourself in anything you've ever done before. And so it's a principle that I don't know exactly how to put it into words or into one single word of divinity as we're looking at it now, but that's the notion that I'm trying to get to there. The whole idea of incest, many of the myths of Brahma are not only creation myths and not only sexual myths, but they are incest myths. And incest is one thing that is horrified by every culture, but yet is practiced frequently in every culture, and I think that is a material misunderstanding of the principle of divine incest. The principle of divine incest is a recognition that we are within a closed system. Within the womb of the unknown, within the womb of potential, there is only one. And therefore it is out of oneself that one must create. That in order to be divine or to unfold our divine consciousness, whether in hierarchy or just per se, we cannot look outside of ourselves for something that's magically going to give us our consciousness. It's only when we realize that it is an incestual thing that we go inside of ourselves and find something of one in us and unite with that. It doesn't preclude an external activity that waking consciousness or creation begins. All right, I want to move on a little bit faster because I don't want this to be more than 90 minutes because I have a promise that because tapes get so expensive for people that I'll keep it short. Now we move forward in time again to the Vishnu Purana. And in the Vishnu Purana, the cyclicity is mentioned right away in the beginning. It says, all creatures, all creators are destroyed in cosmic dissolution to be born again according to karmic merit. So right away from the beginning, there's a notion that the whole process of creation is something that goes on and on. You have the same players and that nothing is lost. Brahma creates the fourfold creatures from the gods to the inanimate objects mentally. Brahma creates gods, demons, ancestors, humans. Interesting, a lot of interesting notions that we're not going to go into here. We could tell the same stories again tomorrow night and go into them in a totally different way because it's all that stuff. First, Brahma concentrates and the demons of darkness are born. It's like before there is a realization truly of self and of light, there's a realization that you don't know everything. That's where the curiosity and all of that desire comes from. And after this, Brahma abandons this body of darkness which becomes night. Now this is told in a very prosaic, down-to-earth way. Then he found pleasure after he had discarded the body of darkness. He found pleasure in a body of light. And the gods were born from his mouth. And he abandoned that body also. And when he abandoned that body, it became day, and that became the realm of the gods. And then he took pleasure in another body, which was a body of twilight. And when he abandoned that body, it became the twilight and the realm of the Pitris, or the ancestors. We're going to talk about them toward the end of the year. And then he took pleasure in another body, which was something like early twilight, and from that humans were born. And then he took a body of passion, from which the Rakshasas or Raksasas were born, and eventually the animals were born. and then he discarded that body. And then from his body of energy, plants and birds were born, and he discarded that body. Eventually, he forms all of the forms, great and small, and their seasons and movements were born. With each creation, he rises to new heights. Really, it's a beautiful cosmological story. It's like saying what it says in the very first line, or very second line, that all creatures are born again according to their merit. And this is an interesting concept, that the demons have a higher merit than the gods, which is very, very interesting, that all of the, I don't want to go too far into it, but all of the gods developed their power by overpowering demons. And I think the demons represent some kind of a buffer zone. The realm of night represents something between an ineffable darkness and light. And that the objectifying things in night as opposed to an ineffable unknown darkness represents something being brought from a demon state to a divine spiritual state. And the whole formula of spirit being fed on soul from the interaction with matter or the unknown or darkness is indicated there in one very brief sentence. But we're getting way too long here. Everything is born in succession, and here we have the whole idea of the spiritual consciousness being raised higher and higher and higher as forms of greater and greater, or as hierarchies of consciousness of greater and greater density are thrown off. You might say that the process of creation and the process of elimination are intimately involved. By throwing off something and saying, I am not that, and eliminating that, but you have to know that very clearly to know that you are not that, is how the practicing of asceticism in self-knowing takes place. It doesn't take place apart from forms. It takes place in such a way that you know them, you create them, and you say, no, I am not that. And that's the very thing that brings them to life. Now, this is a really interesting creation because it is a creation of consciousness, and the forms come out of the consciousness. And the higher forms of consciousness are produced first. First gods are produced, then ancestors are produced, then humans are produced, and then animals. Like what is reawakened from its past state of existence as far as it came into its own, living off of the light that was thrown off of the divine. When the divine said, I am not that, it gave itself to that. It said, I'm not that. That life that comes down to us is sort of like we're living off the offal of God. As wonderful as what it is that we experience in our divine meditations and the love of all of that, relative to the pure nature of the divine, we are living off of the awful, that which is radiating down into us. And it's saying that the intelligence is created first, and we take up from where we left off before. This is an exceedingly sophisticated creation myth. It's very much like the second creation in the Gospel of Genesis, where human beings were made first, and then the animals, and then the plants. That is the evolution of consciousness first, and then the forms come later. All right, I don't want to get. We're getting way, way too long. From here, we not only see that self-knowledge comes from knowing something and knowing that it is really not self, even though it is a perfect reflection of what self used to be. self-knowing is just the opposite of legislation. Legislation is formed when it's too late. We pass a law, and by the time the law gets passed, it's already accepted that this is the problem and what we have to do about it. But it's like saying that self-knowing is you know yourself by knowing that that's not you, and you're throwing that off behind you in time. The thing that I really want to get to, and that's the thing that we're talking about for the whole year, is the fact that divinity is hierarchical. It is to say that for the one to know itself more fully and to throw off this abundance, which can be looked at as an awful, it has to do this in a hierarchical fashion. You might say the whole process of self-becoming, of self-knowing, of creation, of divine becoming is a process that is hierarchical, or else there is no unity of one being that is realized through the hierarchical differentiation. I don't know how to say it any other way. This is a thing that is specialized most deeply in the Islamic mysticism and mythology. It's the whole concept of the relationship of the one and the many. And maybe I'll get some Islamic mythology in here because I haven't done anything of that yet. And there are all those lovely things by Seven Hossein Nasr, who is probably one of the best cosmological and spiritual thinkers living right now. He's an excellent, great man. Let's do one little more story going way, way back to the Vedas, and then we'll have some scattered thoughts about Brahma, and then we'll call it a night for tonight because we will have one of the attributes of the divine understood, and we will have introduced why hierarchy must be. From Brahma, Viraj was born. And Viraj is another name for Vishnu. And from Vishnu, Purusa, the first human or the first one, was born. You see the whole notion of Trinity coming out here. Oh, here we come again. 3/4 of Purusa remained above. 1/4 remains here. It pervades that which eats and which does not eat. So we're back to the whole idea of consumption again. The human was spread as the sacrifice in everything which is offered. Now this is the whole idea, again, that we discussed somewhat last year in the myth of Dionysus. In this case, it's Purusa who is the one. Purusa is actually described as having millions of heads and millions of arms and things like that, giving the idea that once there is the divinity, division within divinity between Prajapati and Viraj, that division makes possible multiple. And when humans or ones are born, they're born with multiple capabilities. But those multiple capabilities are still contained within one, and they are only there in principle. They are only there in idea. And it is only when they are offered as sacrifice, that is, when they are divided and cut into parts or broken into parts, or in the case of Dionysus, torn into parts, that they become many. But even there is a differentiation that as soon as there is division and the sacrifice is made, it is made between those who are consumed and those who are consumers. And there are
and it works both ways. They serve each other. The consumed and the consumers are interchangeable. You might say that we consume plants. Therefore, the plants are the consumed. But if you look in the other direction, we consume the ideas of God, or we consume the ideas of love. And the Vedantin metaphysics is one of the most sophisticated and complicated in the world, because it has all of these dualities and divisions within itself, so that when you get to the Vedantin pundits, they have, this is just toy stuff that we're talking. We're just trying to draw out the simplest ideas, but we're seeing that the whole idea of consumed and consumers is that there is a two-way street in this. This is like saying, in the same way that Prajapati gives and at the same time receives by rising upward and inward within, that this is true throughout the cosmos, that all assertions are like the thrusts of Prajapati with his daughter, that they go both ways, that there is a giving and a receiving at the same time, but that it is the attitude of sacrifice which gets it going. From Purusa, the regions, the heavenly bodies, the earthly human beings, the animals, plants, all were born. And this was the sacrifice of the first dharmas. Meaning to say, this is again the creation story. The other way around, this is first the forms are born of the planets, and then the plants and animals, and building up to the human. This is the creation by form again, and this represents the entire. It represents the entire cosmos itself as a divine creative principle that is in order. I don't know how to say this. The concept of Dharma is the same concept as the ninth house in astrology, that it represents the ideals or the religious form to which we aspire. Karma is the law. Dharma is the form of spiritual rightness. And basically what is being said in this myth is that there is a divine form to the intent and the purpose of the cosmos. And that no matter how great the deviations may be, this is the original primordial idea, the original primordial atom to which all things aspire. And this is a notion that is very much abused, as all religious things are often abused, so that people often become very traditionalistic and very formal, and they think it has to be done only one way, without realizing that that one way is so big that there are many ways within that one way. And I guess the best way that the Dharma could be understood is that there is a rightness. There is a purpose to the entire creation, and that by contemplating that, or by sacrificing to our position within that, we can know that and become at one with that. Funny that this is a course in Christian mysticism. We're talking Hinduism all night. This is this one shows very clearly that the nature of the divine is intelligence. Everything is produced from the divine mind, and everything that is produced in the image of the divine intelligence. And we are of that same nature. And when we know that, we become at one with that oneness in the same nature. The hierarchy of Brahma is in Brahma, and it is in us. This is a microcosm, macrocosm type of myth, and I guess I don't want to say too much more because we'll be carrying on.
more later on, and I'm trying to cut short. I want to talk about some things of pictures and attributes of Brahma. Brahma is always considered, like all father figures, the lord of seeds and germs, especially unexpanded germs. Everything that lives, what you might say, in a black hole state, or when everything was compact into a state of one. Brahma is always pictured as being four-headed or sometimes five-headed, meaning pointing in all four directions. Sometimes in images is pictured as red, a fire red color, meaning to say that it is a lively being. It is almost always associated with the sun, even if it is a dark sun from which the light sun develops. This place is very heavily insulated, and that's why there is a lot of expansion along the dry well. The spouse of Brahma is Sakti, or Saraswati, and is the nature of harmony and of art, meaning to say that the unconscious part of Brahma, the receptive part, contains the harmony, and that can only be understood by the union or by the giving or sacrifice of selfhood into the manifest part. I'm just going to mention a few things that we're going to come back to later, because there are a number of different hierarchies and evolutions we're going to look into. Strangely enough, in elemental psychology, Brahma is associated with earth. Sometimes Brahma is called Kamalayoni, meaning mystic lotus matrix, meaning to say that the lotus of the mouth and the yoni, which is the womb, are one and the same thing. All of the Hindu trinity have vehicles, and the vehicle of Brahma is the Hansa, or swan. Sometimes it's called the goose. What we talked about earlier, remember, first there was the dark night, the dark space, and then from that was born the light space. That's the story of the birth of that's the goose that laid the golden egg. In all schools of initiation, even all the way down to Wagner's Lohengrin, the swan, which floats beautifully above the water and engenders it and gives it beauty by singing its swan song, is associated with the highest of initiates. This goes so far, for example, as a famous initiate in the last century, Paramahansi Yogananda, meaning the highest swan, is what the name means. The items that Brahma always carries with him are the Vedas, and that means to say that the original Dharma, or the original order, or that even the divine is subject to the Vedas. I don't want to get into that because I'd get way too long. Again, I'm having to practice restraint, which is probably a good form of asceticism for me to practice. Brahma always carries rosaries, and Brahma is the divine being that meditates or contemplates himself in the rosaries, that is like each one being an evolution, a planetary, a sphere of consciousness that is emanated from the divine in a cyclical way. That's another thing we won't have time to look into. The implements that Brahma always carries with him are the spoon. He carries the lustral spoon and he carries the little vessel of purifying water. This goes back to the ultimate source of creation being the ultimate source of dissolution. That it is by not paying attention that everything is dissolved. That when there is a divine weariness or there is a divine withdrawal, everything goes back, and the ultimate source of that floats on the waters of life that does the creating is also the ultimate source of dissolution in the lustral waters that dissolve everything back into the one. And that's as far as we'll go tonight. Next time we'll talk about Vishnu, and it'll be very much different because the character is different and even the stories are very different in the character of Vishnu. And then we'll talk about Shiv, and then we'll talk about divinity altogether, and then we'll talk about the hierarchy among the Hindus, and then we'll move on to Egypt. That's about it.